Chapter 1: Shadows in the Night. A cold mist hung in the back alleys of the city, swirling around the lone figure of a young woman as she hurried home. It was past midnight in late autumn 1988, and the streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the damp pavement. The steady tap of her heels echoed off brick walls. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following her. Her breath hitched as she passed a flickering neon bar sign. The alley beyond was a shortcut she often took, a narrow canyon of darkness between shuttered storefronts. Tonight, though, it felt like a gauntlet. She hesitated at the threshold of shadow, then chided herself for being paranoid and stepped in. The air smelled of wet garbage and something metallic. Her pace quickened. Halfway through, a sound behind her, a scuff of shoe on concrete, made her heart leap. "Hello?" she called, voice trembling. No answer. Only the distant hum of traffic and her own pulse thudding in her ears. She fumbled in her purse for her keys, holding them like a weapon. "Is someone there?" she whispered, backing toward the far end of the alley. Suddenly, a swift motion from the darkness. A silhouette emerged from behind a dumpster, tall, clad in black, face obscured by the low brim of a cap. Before she could scream, a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Her eyes widened in terror. In that split second, she caught a whiff of something on the attacker, a mix of leather and the faint trace of cologne. She thrashed desperately. Her keys clattered to the ground. The attacker was impossibly strong, dragging her deeper into the shadows. A flash of steel glinted as a knife was drawn. Moonlight briefly illuminated the blade edge. She tried to plead, but only muffled cries escaped into the night. The blade came to her throat, and with a vicious, precise motion, it was over. Warm blood trickled down her collar as her body went limp. The shadowy figure lowered her gently to the ground, as if in some twisted mockery of compassion. The deed was done swiftly, brutally. For a long moment, the killer stood over the corpse, chest heaving in the dark silence. In the faint glow of the streetlight at the alley's mouth, only the killer's eyes were visible, cold and fixated on the lifeless form at his feet. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city, but no one came. With methodical calm, the killer knelt and retrieved something from the victim, a small silver locket that had fallen from her neck in the struggle. Slipping this trinket into a pocket, the figure melted back into the darkness. By the time the alley was empty again, the only sign of the horror that had unfolded was the crimson pool spreading slowly around the woman's body and the set of bloody footprints leading away into the night. Chapter 2: Daylight and Darkness. Detective Frank Chapman sipped bitter coffee from a styrofoam cup as he surveyed the scene cordoned off by patrol officers the next morning. The alley was now crowded with flashing red and blue lights, crime scene tape fluttering, and the low murmur of police radios. Frank had seen more than his share of violent death in his 15 years on the force, but it never got easier. He ran a hand through his graying brown hair and knelt near the victim, careful not to disturb the evidence markers. The young woman lay on her back, eyes glazed and fixed on nothing. An EMT had draped a sheet over most of her body, but her pale face, framed by dark hair, remained visible. Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mixture of anger and sorrow. She can't be more than 25, he thought grimly, another life snuffed out. Beside him, Detective Alan Reynolds clicked his tongue in frustration. "Third one in 6 weeks, Alan said quietly, flipping open a small notepad. Frank's partner was a sharp-eyed man in his late 30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a calm demeanor. Alan liked to joke that he had ice water in his veins, handy for a homicide detective. His steady hands belied any emotion this morning, as he sketched the body's position. Same MO as the others. Late night, young female victim, throat slashed. Frank nodded, rising to his feet. His knees popped, a reminder of too many long nights and stakeouts. And no witnesses in sight, he added. It frustrated him. A serial killer was stalking the streets, yet they were grasping at shadows. The media hadn't caught wind of a serial killer label yet, but Frank knew it was only a matter of time. Each crime scene so far had been an alley or a secluded spot, with no CCTV cameras and no apparent connection between victims. In the late 1980s, detective work still leaned heavily on gut instinct and old-fashioned legwork. There were no quick DNA tests or citywide surveillance cameras to save the day. Alan looked up from his notepad. Forensics will confirm, but I'd bet she was killed with a knife just like the others. Single clean cut, likely a hunting knife or combat blade. He gestured to the medical examiner, who was zipping the body into a black bag. I say the time of death was around midnight. Frank rubbed his chin. The pattern was there, but so far it brought them no closer to a suspect. Let's have CSU sweep every inch. Maybe this time our guy slipped up, he muttered. He glanced around the alley. The morning sun hadn't yet reached here. It was still dim, crime scene techs moving with flashlights and cameras. A photographer's flash strobed, capturing the scene on 35mm film. Sergeant Ramirez, the precinct's veteran crime scene investigator, approached holding a clear evidence bag. Detectives found this near the body. Inside was a blood-stained key ring with a few house keys. Frank recognized it, likely what the victim had dropped. He sighed. No ID on her yet? Frank asked. Ramirez shook his head. No purse or wallet here. If she had one, the perp might have taken it, or it could be lost. He nodded to a female officer, gently taking the victim's fingerprints for later identification. Frank frowned. Robbery doesn't seem to be the motive, same as before. The purse was missing last time too, but credit cards weren't used. The guy probably takes a trophy. Frank felt a chill. Many killers keep trophies, grim mementos of their crimes, like a purse, jewelry, or keys, he said, looking at the ring in Ramirez's hand. He wondered if something else had been taken. He scanned the ground where the body had been. A dark patch of dried blood remained. Something glinted in it. Hold on. Frank crouched and used a pen to lift a delicate broken chain from the coagulated blood. The pendant was gone, only a broken clasp and a bit of chain. She had a necklace that got snapped, Frank noted, showing Alan. The killer might have taken the pendant. Alan narrowed his eyes. If our guy's collecting trophies, he's even more dangerous. Means he's savoring this. Alan's tone was clinical, but Frank caught a hardness underneath it too. Detectives often develop a shell, but something about these murders had been getting to Alan. Frank placed the broken chain carefully into another evidence bag Ramirez held open. Let's log everything. We need to identify her and notify the next of kin. Maybe someone reported her missing overnight. As the CSU continued their methodical sweep, Frank lit a cigarette. Smoking on scenes was frowned upon, but at this point, he needed nicotine more than protocol. He watched his partner, who now knelt where the killer had likely stood. Alan was tracing something on the ground, a faint boot print visible in a puddle of blood diluted by the morning dew. It was large, probably a man's boot, size 11 or 12. Alan looked up. Print's not great. Hard to get a cast out of wet concrete, but I'll have them try. Frank walked over, exhaling a stream of smoke. Better than nothing. He peered at the partial print. The tread had a distinctive zigzag pattern. He filed that detail away. Could match a common boot, maybe military surplus or work boots? They were grasping at any straws. No witnesses, no suspects. Frank ground the cigarette under his shoe. All right, let's head back to the station and start piecing together what we have. Maybe VAP, Victim Analysis Profile, can find a link between the victims. Alan stood, stretching his back. If there is one, right now it looks like he's choosing at random. Frank had the same fear. Random victims made profiling nearly impossible. It meant anyone could be next. They left the scene as the body was loaded into the coroner's van. Frank's unmarked sedan was parked nearby. Before getting in, he paused to survey the alley one last time. In the daylight, it looked ordinary, just another grimy city backstreet. But in his mind's eye, he could picture the horror that took place hours ago. He silently vowed, not this time. He would chase this shadow to the ends of the earth if he had to. Back at the precinct house, a squat brick building that smelled of old coffee and paperwork, Detective Chapman and Reynolds spread files on their shared desk. A city map was pinned to the corkboard on the wall, and 3 red pins marked the locations of each murder. The pins formed a loose triangle covering a few square miles of downtown. Frank tapped the map. All within a short drive of each other. Possibly he lives or works around here. Alan added, or cruises in from elsewhere but feels comfortable in these neighborhoods. He flipped through the file of victim number 1. First was Carla Mendez, 22, a waitress, killed behind the diner where she worked in late September. Second was Linda Everett, 30, an office manager found in an alley near her bus stop 3 weeks later. He glanced at the new folder labeled Jane Doe number 3. Frank sighed, massaging his temple. No obvious connection between them that we found. We know different ages and jobs and have no shared acquaintances. They didn't live in the same area. The only link is time of day and method. Alan leaned back, scanning their handwritten notes. All young women, though. Maybe he has a type. Frank nodded. Possibly. The age range is 20s to 30s, with dark hair on 2 of them. It could be a coincidence. We need to see if the ME found... I pulled out a document from Linda Everett's case folder. I reported slight traces of skin under her nails. She may have scratched her attacker. He pointed to a black and white crime scene photo where the victim's hand showed broken nails. Alan arched an eyebrow. Did they get any useful material from it? Frank replied, some frustration in his voice. In 1988, advanced forensic tests like DNA profiling were still new and not something their department could do quickly. We should send it out to the state lab, at least to see if they can determine blood type. Alan shrugged. Could take weeks, but yeah, it's worth a shot. If it's type B, and we find a suspect with type B blood, not exactly a smoking gun, but it's something.
Chapter 3. Fragments of Light. Frank and Alan threw themselves into the investigation for the next few days. They interviewed Emily's co-workers at the cafe, canvassed the neighborhood near the murder scene, and re-examined every shred of evidence from the prior cases. Despite their efforts, solid leads remained elusive. As rain pelted the city streets one afternoon, Frank sat in their cluttered office, staring at the board of crime scene photos and maps. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the windows matched his frustration. A knock on the doorframe. Officer Patel from dispatch poked her head in. "Detectives, we just got a call," she said, holding a slip of paper. "A witness might have seen something on the night of the last murder. I thought you'd want to follow up ASAP." Frank's head snapped up. "A witness? Why are we hearing this only now?" Patel shrugged apologetically. The caller was hesitant. He anonymously phoned it into 911 this morning and said he saw a suspicious man near that alley around midnight. Left a callback number for you. Frank exchanged a quick look with Alan. This was the break they had been waiting for. "Thanks. We'll take it from here," he said, grabbing the note. Outside, the rain had let up to a drizzle as they headed to their car. Frank dialed the number from a payphone in the lobby. Out of habit, he didn't fully trust cell phones. Not that they had any handy. In 1988, personal cell phones were rare luxury items. Detectives like Frank relied on their car radios and payphones to communicate on the go. After a few rings, a cautious male voice answered. "This is Detective Chapman with Metro Police," Frank said evenly. "You reported you might have seen something the night of the Emily Dawson murder?" There was a long pause. Then, "Yes, I'm not sure if it's important, but I might have seen the guy you're looking for." Frank signaled Alan to pick up the extension on another line to listen in. We're very interested in anything you see. What's your name, sir? Another pause. Rather not say over the phone. I'm scared. What if he finds out I talked to you? Frank lowered his voice reassuringly. We can keep your identity confidential. Our priority is to keep you safe and catch this killer. Please, any detail could help. The man exhaled shakily. All right, my name's Harold Grant. I live near that alley, in the apartment building across the street. I have trouble sleeping, so I sometimes look out my window at night. That night, I saw a car parked with its lights off and engine running around midnight. I thought it odd that most folks don't park there that late. Then I saw a man run out of the alley and jump into the driver's side. The car took off. Frank felt a spark of hope. Did you get a look at the man or the car? Anything you remember could be useful. Make, model, color, part of the license plate, anything. Harold hesitated, thinking. It was pretty dark. The car might have been a black or dark blue sedan, maybe a Ford. It could have been an LTD or a Crown Vic, old police cruiser type, you know? It had one taillight that was out. As for the man, I only saw him for a second under the streetlight when he passed. Medium height, I guess, maybe around 5 feet 10 inch. He wore a cap or hat pulled low, dark jacket. I'm sorry I didn't see more. No, that's very helpful, Alan interjected. Frank could almost see his partner giving a thumbs up. A busted taillight in an old dark sedan, that's something we can work with. You didn't catch any part of the plate number? I'm afraid not, Harold said regretfully. It all happened fast. Frank tore off the page in his notebook where he'd scribbled notes. Mr. Grant, would you be willing to meet us in person? Perhaps come down to the station, or we can come to you to make an official statement? We can arrange protection if you're worried. Harold's voice quivered. I guess so, if it helps. Just don't want him to know I talked. We'll keep it discreet, Frank promised. They arranged to meet Harold later that evening at his apartment, rather than risk him being seen at the station. After hanging up, Alan let out a low whistle. Dark sedan, busted taillight? That could be our guy's car. That's the first real description we've got. Frank felt cautiously optimistic. It's not much, but it's a start. We should check recent reports of cars with a busted taillight or any vehicle stopping in that area that matches that description. Also, see if any of our known creeps drive something like that. Alan was already on it, flipping through a filing cabinet where they kept info on local suspects. There's a known peeper, Jack Felton, who lives a few blocks from one of the scenes and drives an old blue Chevy. But as far as we know, his car doesn't match the taillight detail. They spent the next hour cross-referencing vehicle registration records on paper printouts and calling a contact at the DMV for any black or blue sedans registered to ex-cons in the city. It was tedious work, the kind of grunt work Frank almost found comforting. It was tangible action, even if it often led to nowhere. By early evening, they had a short list of possibilities, but nothing concrete. Frank glanced at the clock. Time to go meet our witness. They drove out to Harold Grant's address as dusk settled. Frank steered their unmarked sedan through the glistening streets, headlights cutting through leftover mist from the rain. Alan rode shotgun, quiet, focused. He's brave for coming forward, Alan said after a stretch of silence. If it were me and I thought I saw a serial killer, I might keep my head down. Frank grunted in agreement. He's doing the right thing. Let's ensure we do right by him and use what he gives us. They pulled up to an old brick apartment building across from the alley where Emily was killed. The area looked much different at twilight than in the glare of crime scene lights. Now it was just another damp, dim city street corner. Harold buzzed the men and they climbed 2 flights of creaky stairs. He greeted them at his door. He was a nervous, middle-aged man with a pouch and a threadbare sweater. He peered up and down the hall before letting them in. Inside, Harold's apartment was cluttered but tidy. He led them to the window facing the street. That's where I saw it, right under that lamppost. The alley entrance was visible from here. They went over his story in detail, Frank gently guiding him with questions, Alan taking notes. Harold's hands shook as he demonstrated how the man ran to the car. Frank placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're doing great. This is very helpful." When they finished, Frank said he'd need him to sign a written statement of what he saw. "As a precaution, we can arrange for an officer to monitor this building at night." Harold's eyes widened. "You think he might come after me? I didn't see his face." "It's unlikely," Alan interjected with a reassuring smile. "But we want to be sure you feel safe. The fact that you saw anything at all might spook him if he somehow knew. Better safe than sorry." Harold nodded, moisture on his brow. "Thank you. I appreciate that." Frank left Harold with their card and instructions to call if he remembered anything else or felt in danger. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Grant. You've given us a new lead that could make all the difference." As they walked back to their car, night had entirely fallen. The street was quiet except for distant sirens and the hum of a street lamp overhead. Frank looked toward the alley, recalling the blood-stained scene now gone. In the glow of the streetlight, he pictured a dark sedan lurking, a killer watching from within. The idea made his skin crawl. "He's out there, Alan," Frank muttered as they entered the car. "We'll get him. Sooner or later, everyone slips up." He gave Frank a sidelong glance. This witness could be the slip. Frank hoped that he was correct.
Chapter 4. Blood in the Water. 2 nights later, another storm rolled in. A harsh rattle of thunder shook the windows of Frank's modest apartment as he reviewed the case files spread across his kitchen table. Lightning flashed, illuminating the wall clock. It was nearly midnight. He took off his glasses and rubbed tired eyes. Across the table were crime scene photos, witness statements, and lists of possible suspects. Harold Grant's statement was paper-clipped to the top. So far, their search for the dark sedan was ongoing. Uniformed officers had been quietly checking parking lots and side streets in the target area for any car with a broken taillight. Frank leaned back, sipping cold coffee. His body was exhausted, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the victims: Carla, Linda, Emily, and he feared there would be more if they didn't catch a break. There was an old saying he'd heard early in his career: serial killers don't stop until they're caught. The thought made him shiver. A sudden ring of the phone jolted him from his thoughts. It was past midnight. A call at this hour could only mean trouble. He snatched up the receiver. "Chapman here." "Frank, it's dispatch," crackled a familiar voice over the line. "They just found a body. Another one." Frank's stomach dropped. He grabbed a pen. "Where?" "Greenwood Park, near the old fountain. It's a female victim, which matches the pattern. Patrol just secured the scene and called it in. They said it's bad." Thunder boomed as Frank thanked the dispatcher and hung up. He hurriedly shrugged on his shoulder holster, feeling a chill that wasn't from the storm. A 4th victim. The killer was accelerating, only a little over a week since Emily. Frank arrived at Greenwood Park half an hour later, the rain pounding the pavement in waves. Red and blue lights strove through the trees as uniformed officers pushed back a perimeter. He spotted Alan's car already there and Alan himself standing under an umbrella near the fountain, talking to a patrolman. Frank splashed over, rain soaking through his trench coat. Alan saw him, and his face was grim beneath the brim of his fedora. "It's her, Frank, the missing girl from campus." Frank's heart clenched. Campus. He then remembered. 2 days ago, a university student had been reported missing by her roommate, Sandra Lopez, age 19. They had been on alert, but hadn't connected it firmly to our case yet, as she was a bit younger and vanished from a different part of town. Now, it seemed the worst was confirmed. They approached the scene. In the center of the park, near an old stone fountain filled with stagnant water,
lay the body of a young woman in a mud puddle. She wore a rain-soaked college sweatshirt. Even in the dark, the similarities were apparent. Her throat was slashed deeply, and her body displayed signs of a struggle. Blood had mixed with rainwater, trailing red rivulets across the concrete. Frank felt anger churn in his gut as he looked down at the victim. So young. Sandra had barely started her life. She had been walking back from a late class when she disappeared. Now here she was, discarded in the open. It was a deviation from the alley pattern. This was a public park. The killer was getting bolder, less cautious, or perhaps deliberately taunting them. He wanted her found, Frank said through clenched teeth. This spot. He left her out in the open, and quickly, before we could even fully work the last leads. Alan nodded, face set in hard lines. Rain dripped off his hat onto his coat. It's like he's challenging us now, or maybe he couldn't resist the urge and got sloppy with location. Alan's eyes flickered with an emotion Frank couldn't place, something between anger and excitement. They crouched by the body as CSU technicians hurried to set up under tarps to preserve evidence from the downpour. Frank carefully brushed a strand of wet hair from the victim's face to see better. A nasty purple bruise marred her cheek. Likely she'd been struck. There were defensive cuts on her arms. She had fought. Any sign of... But Alan held up an evidence bag. Inside was a torn piece of fabric. This was in her hand. She ripped it off the killer's clothing. Maybe. Looks like a piece of black cloth, possibly from a sleeve. Frank examined the scrap through the plastic. It was black denim or canvas, and a few threads were under the victim's nails. She hurt him. He might have scratch wounds again. A flash of memory, Linda Everins' broken nails and the hint of skin found, came to Frank's mind. Perhaps this victim got even more of the killer under her nails. If they could retrieve that, blood type or even the nascent DNA profiling could be attempted. An ambulance crew waited somberly for the all-clear to remove the body. Frank stood up, letting them do their work once the scene was documented. He noticed Alan wandering a few yards away, scanning the ground with a flashlight in the rain. Frank joined him. "What is it?" Alan pointed at something glinting on the grass. Another evidence tech walked over and picked it up with gloved hands. It was a small charm bracelet, delicate, likely the victim's. A couple of charms were missing, one dangled by a link. The tech bagged it. "Charm bracelet's broken," Alan remarked. "Might have caught on something during the struggle, but see the missing pieces? Perhaps the killer pocketed them if they fail." Frank frowned. The idea of the killer scooping up charms from a bracelet as trophies, like someone collecting pieces from each kill, crossed his mind. So far, each scene has had something taken. A purse, locket. This would fit. Another trophy, maybe. Lightning flickered overhead, and the park was illuminated bright as day for a split second. In that flash, Frank saw the determination on Alan's face. It mirrored Frank's feelings of fury and resolve. This had to end. By 3 a.m., they were back at the precinct, huddled in the bright lights of the nearly empty detective bureau. Both of them were dripping, having barely dried off. Frank pinned a fourth red marker on the city map, Greenwood Park. Now, the area of activity had expanded slightly northward. "The pattern is changing, Frank," said he, breaking the silence. "This victim doesn't fit as neatly. She's younger, a student, and in a park rather than an alley."
"Maybe he's expanding his hunting ground," Alan offered, stirring sugar into a fresh cup of coffee. "Could be an escalation or just opportunity. She was walking alone at night like the others." Frank nodded. "She still fits generally. Young female, alone at night. Only location varied. Maybe he couldn't find a convenient alley given the campus area, so he used the nearby park." They listed out everything new from this murder. Victim, Sandra Lopez, 19, a university student. Time, likely earlier that evening, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m. when she went missing. Evidence, a scrap of black cloth, potentially from killer's clothing, more probable DNA or blood under nails if lucky.
missing charms from a bracelet, which might be trophies. Frank tapped a pen on the desk. We should alert hospitals. If he cut him, he might have wounds. See if anyone comes in with unexplained deep scratches or cuts tonight or tomorrow. Alan agreed and went to make the calls. Meanwhile, Frank scribbled on the whiteboard, cloth from killer's sleeve and trophy charms. As he wrote, his mind churned on the idea of trophies. What did the killer do with them? Keep them as souvenirs to relive the murders? Often that was the case in these psych profiles. But it also occurred to him, if they ever found those items, they'd practically convict whoever possessed them. He imagined the killer perhaps had a secret stash at home. The thought made him unconsciously glance at Alan's desk, a passing reflex as he pondered the concept of someone close hiding something. He immediately felt guilty for letting that stray thought wander toward his partner. Alan, come on, get a grip, Frank. He mentally chastised himself. You start suspecting your partner just because he's right here and as frustrated as you? No, Alan was getting soaked alongside him in the rain tonight, determined to solve this. Frank shook the stupid notion away. Alan returned, hanging up the phone. Hospitals are on notice to tip us off if someone comes in with suspicious wounds. If this guy's smart, he'll patch himself up or have an excuse ready. Worth trying, Frank said. He looked at his partner. Alan's usually neat appearance was disheveled, his hair damp and sticking, tie loosened, eyes tired. Frank realized they both looked like wrecks. It had been a hell of a night. We should catch a few winks, clean up. It's almost morning. We'll be useless if we don't recharge a bit. Alan hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, as much as I hate to stop, you're right. Before leaving, they ensured all evidence from the night was logged and sent to the lab first. Frank also left a note for the morning shift to prioritize the analysis of the cloth fragment and any biological traces from the victim's nails. As they parted outside the precinct, the rain had finally stopped. The first faint hint of dawn was breaking, a deep blue lightening the eastern sky. Alan gave Frank a weary salute. Get some rest, Frank. We'll hit it hard again in a few hours. You too, Alan. Frank watched as Alan trudged to his car. Out of habit, Frank's eyes drifted to the rear of Alan's vehicle as the brake lights flashed. Both tail lights lit up fine. Frank chuckled at himself. Now I'm checking my partner's car. Go home, get sleep, he scolded himself inwardly. Frank turned and walked toward his car. The streets were quiet at this pre-dawn hour. He momentarily stood by the driver's door and breathed deeply in the damp air. The city smelled of wet pavement and exhaustion. Somewhere out there, the killer was likely also nursing wounds from Sandra's fierce fight. Frank hoped it hurt like hell. Soon, he murmured into the silence, jaw clenched. Soon, you're going to slip, and I'll be there when you do. As Frank drove off, the Val hung in the air, leaving the nearly empty precinct parking lot behind.
Chapter 5, Crossroads. The next day brought a media storm. By afternoon, news of the Park Slasher, as one sensationalist paper had dubbed the killer, had spread, and the police commissioner held a press conference confirming that they were dealing with a likely serial murderer. Captain Morris had Frank and Alan attend, though neither spoke to the press. Frank watched uncomfortably from the side as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. The captain kept details sparse, urging public caution, promising every resource to catch the perpetrator, and refusing to comment on specifics like evidence or profile. After the conference, the captain pulled them aside in the corridor. Her face was drawn with stress. City Hall is all over my ass on this. People are scared and they want results yesterday. What have you got? We might have a vehicle description, possibly. Witness saw a dark sedan, broken taillight. We're checking on that. And we recovered some evidence from last night's scene that might give us something. Fabric, maybe blood from the killer, labs running tests. Captain Morris nodded. All right, good. I've authorized overtime for anyone you need. Double the patrols at night in target areas. Maybe we'll flush this bastard out. As she walked away, Alan muttered, We'll flush him out all right, hopefully not by finding another body. Frank shared the bleak sentiment.
He suggested they grab a quick lunch at a nearby diner to get away from the madness at HQ and clear their heads. Over sandwiches and coffee, they spoke in low tones at a corner booth, ever mindful of prying ears. The diner's TV played a news segment on the murders, but Frank tried to tune it out. "I've been thinking," Alan said between bites, "about how organized or disorganized our guy is. He's careful in some ways. No prints, no witnesses initially, but now he's getting flashy. What if he's the type that wants recognition? It could be why he left the last body out in a park. It's almost like he's making a statement." Frank stirred his black coffee. "Like he's saying, I can do this anywhere, you can't stop me? Yeah, maybe. That arrogance could be his undoing." "Or it could get more people killed," Alan replied darkly. He sighed. "We might consider bringing in a criminal psychologist or someone to profile him." Frank had thought of that too. "Already put in a request this morning. The state's got a guy who consults, supposed to call us tomorrow." He paused, then rubbed his chin. "Also, I was thinking of re-examining everyone who's even remotely been on our radar. Friends, family of victims, ex-boyfriends, coworkers, anyone with a link. Sometimes serial killers insert themselves into investigations or have a connection we don't see at first." Alan gave a thin smirk. "You're casting a wide net, partner. Next you'll say maybe one of our own could be behind it." He chuckled as if it were a ridiculous joke. Frank slightly chuckled, though the thought had flitted across his mind in dark moments. "Had to consider every possibility." They finished and returned to the station when a call came in from the lab. Preliminary results from the cloth fragment were ready. The detectives hurried down to the forensic lab in the basement.
They decided that night to run a decoy operation. With the killer striking more frequently, some of the younger female undercover officers volunteered to pose as beat in the targeted neighborhoods. Frank wasn't entirely comfortable with it, but many departments use this tactic. They placed 2 decoys with backup teams in 2 areas the killer had hit before, hoping he might prowl there again. Frank and Alan supervised from an unmarked car a block away from one of the decoys. The young officer, Officer Lily Tran, dressed in plain clothes, walked alone along a dimly lit street, feigning distraction as bait. A couple of Vice Squad detectives trailed behind her, and Frank and Alan cruised in the vicinity, their eyes peeled for anyone following or suspicious. It was a tense stakeout. Every shadow and passerby set Frank's nerves on edge. As midnight approached, nothing had happened. Possibly the heavy police presence, plainclothes and patrols, was deterring the killer. Or maybe he had caught wind of the strategy. If he listened to police radio or noticed the unusually high number of figures lurking, he might lay low. At a little past 1 a.m., they called it off for the night. Officer Tran was unharmed and had no sign of their target. Frank felt both relief and frustration. Either he took the night off or he's smarter than to go out during a saturation patrol, Frank grumbled as their team regrouped. Alan rubbed his eyes. At least no one got hurt tonight, but it could push him to wait or change area again. As they parted ways with the decoy team, Frank and Alan returned to the station to wrap up paperwork. The lull gave Frank a moment to reflect. It hit him that aside from the crimes themselves, he knew little about who the killer was as a person. They had no name, no face, just a shadow with a knife. He wondered what could drive someone to such monstrous acts. "You know," he said aloud as he filled out a report, "I keep thinking about motive. Is he doing it for pleasure, rage, some twisted mission?" Alan looked up from his paperwork. "Hard to say. Serial killers often do it for the thrill or compulsion. If he's psychotic, maybe he's satisfying some urge or delusion. Or he hates women, given all victims are female. Could be he had some trauma involving a woman who wronged him." Frank tapped his pen. "If we find any commonality between victims, it might point to motive. So far, all we have is that they were alone at night. They varied in occupation and background, but what if, hypothesizing, what if he knew them or chose them for a reason? We might have missed something." Alan shrugged. "We dug into their lives quite a bit. Nothing popped out. Sometimes there is no rational motive, Frank. The guy could be a psychopath who sees them as easy prey." Frank knew Alan could be right. The uncomfortable truth was that not every killer had a neat Freudian excuse. Some just enjoyed killing. As they wrapped up for the night, Frank realized he hadn't checked in on one lingering piece of the puzzle. The suspect list they'd started from Harold's witness info. They had identified a couple of possible matches for the car. One was that local peeper Jack Felton they'd mentioned, and another was a mechanic with a record of assault whose car roughly fit, but neither had panned out solidly yet. "Tomorrow we should visit those 2 car owners on our list," he said, pulling on his coat. "Sounds good," Alan replied. "Fresh eyes in the morning. Get some rest, Frank." "You too, Alan. Good work today." Frank gave his partner a pat on the back. Despite everything, the dead ends, the horrific new murder, he was grateful to have Alan in the trench with him. Alan was steadfast and competent. He couldn't imagine tackling this nightmare without him. As Frank drove home in the quiet hours, he tried to let the weariness wash over him. But an uneasy feeling gnawed at the edge of his mind. It had been there since the moment he saw Sandra's body in the park. A sense that something about this was building to a head, that they were on the cusp of either a breakthrough or a catastrophe. He pulled into his driveway and sat briefly in the dark car, engine ticking as it cooled. In his reflection on the windshield, he thought he saw a flicker of movement behind him and whipped around, hand instinctively going to the revolver at his side. Nothing, just the shadows of a tree dancing in the breeze under a streetlight. He exhaled, realizing his heart was hammering. Jumping at shadows, Frank scolded himself. But one of these shadows is real. He got out, locked the car, and went inside. He left a lamp on tonight as he finally drifted into a troubled sleep.
Chapter 6, False Dawn. The morning after the decoy operation, Frank arrived at the precinct early. He found a message waiting from the lab. The blood typing from Sandra's case was complete. The killer's blood, gleaned from the skin under her nails, was identified as type B positive. Frank filed that away mentally. It wasn't a rare type, but it could help if they got a suspect. They had a lead to chase before he could share this with Alan. One of the detectives who had been checking vehicle records came by with a possible match for the mysterious sedan. We found a guy in the area with a black 1977 Chevy Caprice, registered to Joseph Harlan. He's got a busted rear left taillight noted in a recent traffic citation, the detective reported. Also has a sheet, aggravated assault back in '84, did a couple of years. Frank's eyes lit up. This was the best candidate yet. Address? Works at a garage over Fulton, lives in an apartment nearby. We've got both locations. Frank thanked him and immediately went to find Alan. They decided to visit Mr. Harlan at his workplace, a small auto repair shop. On the way, they also swung by the address of the other possible suspect, Jack Felton, the neighborhood peeping Tom, just to cover their bases. Felton's building was first. They knocked on the door of his dingy apartment, and the bleary-eyed man who answered hardly fit the image of a cunning killer. Felton was rail-thin, reeked of alcohol, and stammered nervously as they questioned him. He admitted to his peeping habit and being out on one of the murder nights, but insisted he never harmed anyone. A quick search of his apartment, with his reluctant consent, turned up nothing linking him to the murders. No weapons, no stolen items, nothing. His old blue Ford car had both taillights intact and an engine that looked like it hadn't run in weeks. Frank doubted this was their guy. As they left, Alan shook his head. Not our man. The guy could barely keep his story straight about watching his neighbor through a window. He's a creep, but not the organized type for these murders. Agreed, Frank said. Let's focus on Harlan. They drove to the garage on Fulton. It was now late morning, the sun glaring white in a sky bleached of clouds. The repair shop was a corrugated metal building with a couple of bays. A hand-painted sign read, Fulton Auto Service. They spotted the black Chevy Caprice parked off to the side, its left tail light covered with red tape, an improvised fix for a broken lens. Frank's pulse quickened at the sight. A few men in oil-stained coveralls were working on a car inside the garage. Frank flashed his badge and asked for Joseph Harlan. A burly man with grease on his hands pointed toward the office. "Joe, cops here to see you," he called out. A moment later, a man emerged from the small office trailer attached to the garage. He was in his mid-40s, with a thick mustache and wary eyes. Frank noted a scar on his forearm. He wiped his hands on a rag. Yeah, I'm Joe Harlan. What's this about? Frank and Alan exchanged a quick look. They stepped forward, subtly positioning themselves to flank Harlan. Mr. Harlan, Frank began, keeping his tone conversational. We're investigating some recent incidents in the area. Mind if we ask you a few questions? Harlan's eyes darted between the two detectives. Incidents? What kind of incidents? Alan nodded toward the Chevy outside. That your Caprice out there? Broken taillight? Harlan glanced over his shoulder toward his car and shrugged. Yeah, some punk kids cracked it. I haven't gotten it fixed properly yet. That a crime? Frank offered a tight smile. Not at all. We're looking into a matter involving a vehicle like yours. Where were you on the nights of September 22nd, October 15th, and more recently November 2nd? Harlan's brow furrowed. What, are you walking calendars? How the hell should I know? That was weeks ago. I work late at night and sometimes I'm home watching TV. Look, you want to tell me what this is about? His tone was growing defensive. Alan stepped a bit closer. Those dates ring any bells? Perhaps you heard about the murders that happened on those nights. Alan's voice was level but had an edge. Harlan stiffened. Murders? You think That's wild. Like everyone, I heard it on the news. But what? You think it's me? Nah, man. He chuckled nervously, but a sheen of sweat formed on his temple. Frank's instincts prickled. No one's accusing you, Joe. We're just checking all leads. Mind if we take a look at your car? Routine. To rule it out. Harlan's jaw set. You got a warrant for that? Alan's hand suddenly hovered near his holster. If you've got nothing to hide, this will just take a minute. Harlan took a step back. His eyes flicked to the open bay door of the garage, then to the office behind him. I know my rights. You ain't searching nothing without a warrant. The atmosphere was tense. Some other mechanics had paused in their work, sensing trouble. Frank decided to try a softer approach. Joe, cooperating would help clear you. If you're innocent, you want the real killer caught as much as we do, right? His response was to drop the rag and bolt. He dashed between the detectives, catching them off guard for a split second. Hey, Frank shouted, lunging to grab him, but Harlan was fast for his size. He barreled past another mechanic and out into the yard behind the garage. Frank and Alan sprinted after him. Stop! Police! Alan yelled as they gave chase. Harlan knocked over a stack of old tires in their path, slowing them as rubber spilled across the gravel. Frank vaulted over one, adrenaline surging. They rounded the back of the garage where rusted car parts lay. Harlan was headed for a chain-link fence at the lot's end. He began clambering up the fence, rattling it. Frank was seconds behind. He unholstered his service revolver, a standard .38 special still issued to detectives in the late 80s, heart pounding. Harlan, don't make this worse. Get down. At that moment, Harlan twisted to look back, one leg over the fence. Frank saw a flash of metal in Harlan's hand. A gun? Knife? The sun's glare was hard to tell. Harlan raised his arm. Everything happened in an instant. Gun! Alan shouted. A split second later, a shot rang out. Frank flinched, thinking Harlan had fired. But it was Alan's weapon that had discharged, smoke curling from the muzzle of his service pistol. Harlan cried out and tumbled off the fence, crashing to the ground on their side. Frank rushed forward, revolver drawn, and aimed at the fallen suspect. Harlan was on his back, clutching his shoulder where blood was rapidly staining his coveralls. Beside him, on the ground, was a wrench. He'd been holding a wrench, not a gun. Ah, God damn it, Harlan groaned, eyes wide in shock and pain. Alan moved in swiftly, kicking the wrench away and covering Harlan with his gun. Stay down, don't move. Frank holstered his revolver and knelt to press his knee against Harlan's uninjured arm, keeping him pinned. With quick, practiced motions, he pulled Harlan's arms behind him. The man was too weak from the gunshot to resist much, as Frank snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. Suspect down, need a bus, Frank yelled, knowing the other mechanics would likely call an ambulance after hearing the shot. You shot me, you crazy? Harlan gasped through clenched teeth, writhing. Should have stopped, Alan said coldly, still pointing his pistol at the prone man, finger off the trigger now but eyes hard. Frank pressed a hand over the wound to stem the bleeding. He looked at Alan. He's secure. Let's get him upright. Together, they hauled Harlan to a sitting position propped against the fence. Within minutes, the scene was swarming. Uniformed officers had arrived, followed by paramedics. Harlan was alive, conscious but pale, as they loaded him onto a stretcher. Frank walked alongside briefly as they wheeled him to the ambulance. "Why'd you run, Joe?" Frank asked, needing to hear it. He grimaced, breathing fast. "Because I knew you'd frame me or some crap. Guys like me always get blamed. Ain't kill no one." His voice was fading with shock and phased out as the EMTs lifted him in. Frank stepped back, troubled by Harlan's words. If innocent, why run? But people ran for various reasons. Fear, outstanding warrants, panic. Still, something about this didn't feel like the triumphant moment he had anticipated in catching the killer.
Alan clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, we got him." His tone was upbeat, but Frank detected a tremor in it. Perhaps it was the adrenaline. They searched Harlan's car and locker at the garage. In the trunk of the Caprice, under a pile of old clothes, Alan made a find. A large hunting knife in a leather sheath. The blade had reddish-brown stains. "Looks like blood," Alan said quietly, showing it to Frank. Frank's heart thudded. If that tested positive as human blood, it was damning. But whose blood? They also found a small silver locket stuffed in the glove compartment. It matched the description of the one missing from Emily Dawson. Frank's eyes widened as Alan held it up. It was still stained with dried blood. "Son of a... This is Emily's locket," Frank breathed. Alan let out a low whistle. He kept a trophy. Sick bastard. Frank felt a swirl of emotions. Relief that they finally had concrete evidence, confusion at how easily it was found, and a gnawing disquiet that he couldn't quite place. It may be the suddenness of the break in the case. By the afternoon, the police brass were declaring victory. Captain Morris congratulated Frank and Alan personally back at the precinct. "Well done, detectives. We'll still have to confirm everything, but we have our man. The mayor's going to be relieved." Frank forced a smile. "Just doing our job, Captain." Alan was the more vocal, assuring the captain that the evidence was solid and Harlan would confess in no time. Harlan, however, was in surgery and unavailable for interrogation. They posted a guard at the hospital and obtained a warrant to search his apartment. Additional evidence included a few pieces of cheap women's jewelry that could belong to Carla or Linda, though they'd need the families to verify. As the day went on, the entire department seemed to breathe easier. Detectives from other units offered congratulations. Someone even brought out a box of donuts, a rare light moment after weeks of grim intensity. But Frank couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He sat at his desk, staring at the evidence bag containing Emily's bloodied locket, which now lay among the case files. It seemed too easy how that crucial piece turned up. He also recalled Harlan's bewildered denial. Of course, most criminals deny guilt, but something about his words and the look in his eyes as he said, "Ain't kill no one," stuck with Frank. "You're overthinking," he muttered to himself. Stress and lack of sleep were messing with his head. Alan plopped down in the chair opposite Frank, 2 paper cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Frank. "Hell of a day, huh? We should be celebrating. The city's safe again." He grinned, a rare sight. Frank accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Yeah, I just wish he hadn't forced us into shooting. I would have liked a full confession." Alan waved it off. "Bah, guys like that, they'd never confess except maybe to brag. We have the physical evidence. Knife and trophies speak loud." Frank twirled the coffee cup, not drinking. "True. Do you think he acted alone, or could there be any chance of an accomplice?" Alan raised an eyebrow. "Accomplice? Everything points to his solo. Why? You got a theory?" He hesitated. It sounded thin even to himself. "Just making sure we cover all angles. These murders spanned weeks. Do you think he just spontaneously started? His record had an assault, but nothing like this before." Alan shrugged.
Maybe something triggered him recently. Who knows? It could be he escalated from assault to murder. Wouldn't be the first time. The explanation was plausible. Frank tried to let it go. Yeah, you're right. He took a sip of the coffee at last. It was intense and bitter. When Alan got up to speak with some uniforms who had questions, Frank found himself leafing again through the older case notes. Something was itching at the back of his brain. He made a list on his notepad. Harlan's age, mid-40s. He lives alone with no known family nearby. Assault in '84, on record. Bar fight. There was no known connection to victims they'd found yet. Still to check thoroughly. How would he select these women? Purely random off the street? Possible. Then he thought of the witness, Harold Grant, who had seen the car. If Harlan was indeed the killer, then he was the one driving the sedan away that night. Would he have known about Harold giving a statement? It's unlikely unless he overheard or someone leaked it. Yet, that same night, Harold had been unharmed, though fearful. Maybe Harlan never knew someone saw him. That track at least. Frank's eyes drifted to the timeline of murders. Could Harlan be tied to any other incidents outside the city? It's worth checking if similar unsolved cases coincided with his travels or service in the past. He made a note to contact the State Homicide Division to see if Harlan's name popped in any other investigations. For now, the department considered the case closed. Captain Morris advised them to prepare their reports, and she'd expect to charge Harlan once he was conscious. Frank went home with a lighter heart but still restless mind that night. When he finally fell asleep, his dreams were a tangle of images. The alley, the park, a shadowy figure running, and a feeling that he was always one step behind, chasing something he could never quite see.
Chapter 7. Doubt. 2 days passed. Joseph Harlan survived his wound and was recovering in custody at the hospital, though he remained under heavy sedation due to pain meds. The forensic tests on the knife and locket came back. The blood on the knife matched the victim's, and the locket was conclusively identified as Emily Dawson's. It seemed like a slam dunk case. Frank tried to let himself feel closure. Officially, the chief assigned the paperwork to wrap things up, and a press release praised the tireless work of Detectives Chapman and Reynolds in apprehending the suspect. Frank and Alan were invited to a small celebratory drink by some colleagues at a pub, which Frank attended, hoping the camaraderie would chase away his lingering misgivings. But the doubt persisted. On the third morning after Harlan's shooting, Frank sat at his desk early before most others arrived. He found himself drawn back to the case files, not out of necessity, but out of a compulsion to check something. He opened the folder on the first victim, Carla Mendez. Something had been nagging him about dates. He traced his finger over Carla's report. She was killed on September 22. He then looked at Harlan's life events in his record. Harlan's assault conviction in '84 meant he was incarcerated until '86. That was fine, but where was Harlan in the time shortly before these murders began? According to his employment record at the garage, he'd moved to the city only in early September of this year. They had pulled his file. So Harlan arrived in town, and within weeks, supposedly began a spree of serial killings. Possibly if something snapped or if he'd done it elsewhere before. Frank remembered he wanted to check if similar murders had happened in any other cities where Harlan lived. He dug out the background report. Harlan had lived in 2 other cities in the last decade. A stint in Dallas in 1987, brief, just 6 months, and several years in Cleveland before that. Frank's pulse quickened. Cleveland. Wasn't that where Alan had transferred from? If Frank recalled correctly, Alan came from Cleveland PD in 1986 or '87. That was an interesting coincidence, but probably meaningless. Cleveland was a big city. Plenty of murders happened anywhere. Yet an idea formed. Check unsolved homicides in Cleveland to see if they fit the pattern. Frank knew a detective there from a joint case years back. He fetched the phone and dialed long distance. "Cleveland homicide, Detective Rizzo," came a gruff voice after a few transfers. "Well, I'll be damned. Frank, it's Frank Chapman, Metro PD," Frank greeted. "Well, I'll be damned. Frank!"
I heard you got yourself a serial killer over there. Congrats. Frank forced a chuckle. Yeah, that's what they say. Hey, listen, I need a favor. Can you look something up for me? Any unsolved murders in Cleveland in, say, 1985 or 86? Multiple young women killed with similar mo to what happened here? Throat cuts, possibly a serial case? There was a pause. That's out of left field, Frank. Why you asking? Your guy tied to Cleveland? Not officially. Just a hunch I'm following up, Frank said, not wanting to go into detail. It might be nothing. Rizzo grunted. Let me think. We had a bad one in 85. 2 women were killed with a knife about a month apart, both in alleys. We suspected a serial perp, but then it stopped. I never caught the guy. The press called him the alley ripper or some crap. Why do you think it's connected? Frank's mouth felt dry. 2 women killed in alleys? That was eerily familiar. Maybe. Do you recall the timing when it stopped? Yeah, the last one was November 85. Then nothing. We wondered if he skipped town or got jailed on something else. Why? Frank's heart thudded in his chest. Allen transferred to Metro PD in early 1986, if memory served. Could it be? He swallowed. The suspect we caught here, Harland, wasn't in Cleveland then, but another person was, my partner, Alan Reynolds. He was a detective on the force there, wasn't he? Rizzo was silent for a moment. Reynolds? Yeah, I remember him. He was a quiet guy and kept to himself mostly. Hell of an interviewer, though. They got a confession out of stone once. He left in 87 for your city, right? Are you implying? Frank pinched the bridge of his nose. He realized how crazy it sounded. No, probably nothing, Tony. These are just odd coincidences. Thanks for the info. Could you send me any reports on that 85 case, discreetly? Rizzo agreed, though I could sense his curiosity. After hanging up, Frank felt a chill, despite the warm office. He told himself he was being ridiculous. Alan? The same Alan who had worked tirelessly at his side, possibly saving his life when Harlan pulled that wrench. No, Alan shot because he thought we were threatened. He'd shown nothing but dedication. And yet, the pieces started aligning in a way Frank could not ignore. Similar unsolved murders in Alan's old city. They stopped when Alan left. Murders start here after Alan arrives, although there is a year gap unless something triggered him later. And the evidence against Harlan was found almost too easily by Alan's discovery. Frank felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. Was it possible that Alan planted the locket in Harlan's car? He was the one to find it. And the knife, too. Alan rummaged in the trunk first. If Alan was the killer, framing Harlan would be the perfect way out. Harlan ran, making himself look guilty. The department wanted a quick close, so minimal questions were asked. It was almost served up on a platter. No, Frank muttered aloud, pushing back from his desk. He hated this line of thought. It made him feel sick to consider betraying his trust in his partner. But a detective's mind couldn't ignore evidence, however circumstantial or dark. He needed solid proof before accusing Alan or taking it up the chain. If he voiced this and were wrong, it would ruin their partnership and his reputation. Frank realized there was one way to be sure: find the trophies from all murders. They had a few from Harlan's car and apartment, locket, some jewelry. But what about Linda Everett's missing bracelet and Carla's belongings? If Alan was the killer, he might have kept some items hidden. Would he risk keeping them at home? Possibly, if he was confident, or maybe on his desk or in storage. Frank knew Alan's wife had died years ago, and he lived alone in a small house in the suburbs. If he had a stash, it would likely be there. This was dangerous territory, but Frank felt a steely resolve rising. He couldn't involve anyone else, not yet. He had to check quietly. That afternoon, Frank concocted a pretext. He told Alan he had to follow up on some loose ends involving evidence at the lab. Alan shrugged and carried on with the paperwork. In truth, Frank left the precinct with a pit in his stomach and drove towards Alan's neighborhood. He remembered Alan's address from when he dropped him off after a late shift, North Pine Street, number 223.
It was a modest single-story house with a detached garage. No car in the driveway meant Alan was still at work, as planned. Frank parked a block away and approached on foot, his collar turned up against a biting wind that had picked up. He felt like a thief as he circled to the backyard, but he had no warrant, and this was a colossal violation if Alan was innocent. He kept telling himself, if I find nothing, I'll quietly leave and never speak of this. But if he did see something, the back door had a simple lock. Frank, heart hammering, used a Slim Jim he'd brought to slide the lock bolt, an old trick. After a tense minute, it clicked open. He slipped inside. The house was neat and sparsely furnished. Alan didn't display many personal touches. There were no photos on the walls, just generic art. It struck me at that moment how little he knew about Alan's personal life. Did he have close friends? Hobbies? If the answer was no, that fit the profile of a secretive life. Frank moved methodically, conscious of time. He checked the living room, under couch cushions, inside a cabinet. Nothing unusual. The kitchen drawers held typical utensils. He proceeded to the bedroom. The bed was made, closet orderly with suits and casual clothes. Searching the closet, Frank pushed aside hanging shirts to examine the back shelf. Behind some shoeboxes was a small wooden chest locked with a padlock. His pulse quickened. Why padlock a box in your closet unless it holds something important? Frank pried at the clasp using a pocket knife and a small screwdriver. It was sturdy, but he snapped it after some effort, the hasp popping open. He lifted the lid. Inside lay a chilling collection. Several small items that he immediately recognized. A gold wedding band, Carla Mendez's husband had mentioned she wore one, a pair of pearl earrings, Linda Everett's description included missing earrings, 2 silver charms that exactly matched the style of Sandra Lopez's bracelet, and more.
Frank's breath caught. This was it, the trophies. Among them was also a folded piece of paper. He gingerly opened it to find a newspaper clipping from Cleveland dated August 1985 about a murdered woman, marked with a red pen. There was no doubt now. The psycho killer they'd been chasing was Alan, his partner. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he took in the awful truth. Memories rushed back. Alan volunteering to interview the witness alone. Harold had been lucky Alan didn't kill him, perhaps because it was too risky at the apartment. Alan being first on scenes. Alan finding key evidence. A wave of anger and betrayal surged through Frank, but he tamped it down. He needed to act carefully. He decided he had to confront Alan, preferably at the station where the backup was nearby. But if Alan got wind, he might flee or do something desperate. Just then, a floorboard creaked behind him. Frank whirled around, drawing his revolver. In the doorway of the bedroom stood Alan. For a moment, neither man spoke. Alan's eyes flicked from Frank to the open chest and the items in Frank's hand. His face transformed from surprise to an expression of regretful understanding, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "So," Alan said softly, stepping into the room, "you figured it out." Frank felt his mouth go dry. His gun was trained on Alan, but his arms felt heavy with emotion. "Why, Alan, why all this time? It was you?" Alan closed the bedroom door behind him with a calm click. He was remarkably composed for a man caught red-handed. "He didn't want you to know that, Frank," he said gently, nodding at the chest. Frank's heart pounded. "Put your hands where I can see them, Alan," he ordered. Part of him was on autopilot police mode, but another part just wanted an explanation. "Why did you do it? Those women, Harlan almost died because of you." Alan raised his hand slowly to shoulder level, a sad half smile on his lips. "Harlan? That was unfortunate, but necessary. He was a convenient patsy. Men like him, society already thinks the worst. It wasn't hard to make him look guilty, and you all bought it." Frank's jaw clenched. The casual way Alan spoke made his skin crawl. "You murdered innocent women, Alan. Your partner trusted you, and you..." He couldn't finish. Alan sighed, and for a moment,
Frank thought he saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, sadness perhaps. "It's not about you, Frank. You have to understand, it's something I can't stop. I tried. After Cleveland, I tried just to be a normal cop, a good partner. I like you, I do. But the shadows, they always call me back." "Shadows?" Frank echoed, stomach turning. He thought of the title of the case file they had jokingly labeled Chasing Shadows. It wasn't a joke now, it was literal. Alan took a slow step forward. Frank steadied his revolver, finger on the trigger. "Don't move, Alan," he barked. Alan complied, stopping. "What happens now, Frank? Are you going to arrest me? Take me in? Parade me as the monster I am?" His voice had an edge of challenge, but also something else, almost as if he were hurt. "You're damn right I will," Frank said, though the idea of how to achieve that was daunting. Alan was armed too. Frank could see his service pistol holstered on his hip. Thank God he hadn't drawn it yet. Alan chuckled softly. "You don't think you have it in you to shoot me? We've been through the trenches together." He tilted his head. "Remember that night I saved you from that junkie with a shotgun? I could have let you die. I didn't." Frank's mind flashed back to that memory. 6 months ago, a tense standoff, Alan pulling him aside just before a shotgun blast that surely would have killed Frank. It was true. Alan had saved him. The cognitive dissonance was wrenching. This man was a hero in one moment and a devil in others. "I remember," Frank said quietly, "but it doesn't excuse what you've done." Alan nodded. "No, it doesn't. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I didn't want you, of all people, to be the one to catch me. That's not how I pictured this ending." Frank noticed Alan's right hand was inching slightly closer to his hip. "I said keep your hands up," Frank shouted, stepping back to keep their distance. The fear and adrenaline made his voice crack. Alan slowly raised his hands higher again. "Easy, Frank. We're just talking." He sounded eerily like the calming voice he'd use on suspects to lower their guard. Frank realized Alan was likely stalling, maybe looking for a chance to make a move. Frank had to stay sharp. He wished he had called for backup before entering, but it was too late. "What happened to you, Alan?" Frank asked, partly to keep him talking, needing to know. Why kill? Why them? Was it about your wife's death? He grasped at the only thing he knew. Alan's wife had died in a hit-and-run years ago, a fact Alan once mentioned in passing. Alan's face flickered with pain at that. "My wife? No, that hurt me. But that isn't the reason. The truth, Frank, I like it. The power, the control, the freedom. When I kill, I am God in those moments. All my life I've been chasing shadows, things I can't quite grasp or fix. But in the dark, when I hunt, I become the shadow, unseen, unstoppable." Frank felt a chill at those words. This was a side of Alan he'd never glimpsed, a predator's delight? His finger tightened on the trigger slightly. "This ends now," he said firmly. "We're walking out of here. You'll hand over your weapon and I'll take you in, alive or otherwise, Alan. Don't test me." Alan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't doubt your resolution, my friend." He almost whispered the last two words, and for a second, his eyes softened. Then with a resigned breath, he said, "I'm sorry, Frank." In a blur, Alan's right hand darted down toward his holster. Frank reacted on pure reflex, trained by years on the job. The moment he saw Alan move, he yelled, "Don't," and simultaneously fired. The crack of the .38 revolver was deafening in the small bedroom. The recoil jolted Frank's arm. He saw a red blossom burst on Alan's chest. Alan staggered backward, managing to pull his gun as he fell against the wall. A split second later, Alan fired a return shot. The bullet whizzed past Frank's ear, splintering the doorframe behind him. Frank fired again without thinking. This shot caught Alan in the shoulder, spinning him to the floor. Alan's pistol clattered from his grip. Silence crashed in the aftermath. broken only by Frank's ragged breathing and Alan's low groan. Frank approached carefully, kicking Alan's pistol away. Alan lay on his back, blood seeping through his shirt from the chest wound. The shot was near the heart. Fatal, Frank's mind registered clinically. Alan coughed a wet sound. His eyes found Frank's. The malice in them was gone, replaced by something like relief. Blood bubbled on his lips as he tried to speak. Frank knelt by him, gun still in hand, but lowered. "Frank?" Alan rasped, each breath gurgling. "I told you. You didn't have it in you." He gave a weak, wry smile. Frank felt hot tears at the corners of his eyes, shock and sorrow overwhelming him. "Why, Alan? Why? Why didn't you just surrender?" His voice broke.
Alan's gaze wandered to the ceiling. "No cage," he whispered. "Can't live. Behind bars. This better." He grimaced in pain, and Frank pressed a hand to the chest wound instinctively, useless as it was. Blood oozed between Frank's fingers. "Hang on, partner," Frank said, tears mingling with sweat on his face. "I'll get you help." He fumbled for the radio on his belt, forgetting he was off duty with no unit. Instead, he scrambled for the house phone on the bedside table and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As he breathlessly reported an officer's shooting and requested an ambulance, he heard Alan chuckle faintly beside him. "Always thorough, Frank." Alan's voice was barely audible. Frank dropped the phone and leaned over Alan, applying pressure on his wounds futilely. "Alan, stay with me. Don't you die on me, you son of a bitch." It came out half a sob, half an order. Alan's eyes flickered. He seemed to summon the last of his strength to focus on Frank. "You were the best partner I had. I'm sorry." A single tear rolled down Alan's cheek, a final human moment from a man who had become a monster. Then his body relaxed, the tension releasing as his breathing slowed. Frank felt for a pulse on Alan's neck with trembling fingers. It was fluttering weakly. "Hold on! Help's coming!" Frank repeated as if saying it could make it accurate. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Neighbors likely heard the gunshots and had called it in as well. Frank knelt there, blood on his hands and despair in his heart, as he watched the life fade from the man he thought he knew. Alan's lips moved one last time. Frank leaned close to catch it. It was a ragged breath that might have been the word free. Then, Detective Alan Reynolds, Frank's friend, colleague, and the murderer he'd sought, went still. His half-open eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, as if finally chasing shadows no more. Chapter 8. Aftermath. 3 days later, Frank Chapman stood on a hill at Greenlawn Cemetery as a light drizzle fell. A small gathering of police officers and a chaplain were present, along with a closed casket draped in an American flag. Detective Alan Reynolds was being laid to rest with official honors. It was a bitter, surreal affair. Officially, the department maintained that Alan died in the line of duty, slain by the very serial killer he'd been hunting. The truth, that Alan was the killer, was kept quiet. Captain Morris and the brass decided it would do more harm than good to reveal a cop-gone-mad story. The public believed Joseph Harlan was the murderer. With Harlan now vocally proclaiming his innocence and threatening to sue, it was a legal mess quietly brewing. But Frank suspected even Harlan might never learn the full truth. They'd likely cut a deal or find some way to placate him without admitting the whole story. Frank had given a statement to Internal Affairs, a carefully crafted version that omitted Alan's crimes. He stated that he confronted Alan at his home because he found evidence suggesting Alan was hiding leads on the case and Alan had become violent, likely due to stress or a breakdown. In the scuffle, Alan drew his weapon and Frank was forced to shoot. It was a thin cover story, but the department backed it, preferring a narrative of a hero detective tragically snapping under pressure rather than a calculated serial killer in their ranks. The investigation was quietly closed.
Officially, the Shadows Killer, as some media had dubbed the murderer, was considered deceased, though no details were given. As the chaplain recited a prayer, Frank stood with his hands clasped, raindrops trickling off his hat. He felt hollow. He had survived, but at a terrible cost. The man he had chased was by his side all along, and now that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his days. After the brief service, Frank approached the casket and placed a single white rose on it. His fellow officers began to disperse, casting sympathetic glances his way. They all assumed he was grieving a partner killed by a criminal. In truth, Frank was mourning a friend and the shattering of his own trust. Captain Morris came up and gently touched his arm. "How are you holding up, Frank?" He swallowed. "I'll manage, Captain." She nodded. "Take as much time as you need before returning. You've been through a lot, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know he was your friend." Frank just nodded. Words failed him. The captain sighed and left him to his thoughts. As the cemetery emptied, Frank remained. Gray clouds hung low and the city skyline beyond the graves looked blurred in the misty rain. He felt a presence and turned to see Harold Grant standing a few yards away, clutching an umbrella. Harold had sought him out after learning Harlan was exonerated and released. The evidence planting quietly swept under the rug. The witness had pieced together that something was off and had come to suspect the real killer might be someone else entirely. Frank had no intention of confirming anything, but Harold had come to pay respects, sensing perhaps the truth. Harold caught Frank's eye and gave a solemn nod, then left without a word. Finally, Frank was alone. He knelt by the grave, the wet grass soaking his pants. With a trembling hand, he touched the cold casket. He thought of all the nights they'd shared beers after a case, all the gallows-humored jokes, the lives saved together. Was any of it real, or just a mask Alan wore? "I'm sorry, too," he whispered, voice catching in his throat. Sorry that he didn't see it. Sorry he couldn't save Alan from whatever darkness consumed him. Sorry for the lives lost. He stood up, wiping the rain from his face, although some of it was tears. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly. The storm was moving on. As Frank walked to his car, he realized the city felt different now. Every shadow, every alley would hold a memory of this case. The irony was cruel. He had solved the mystery, but the solution broke his heart. Before getting in his car, Frank took one last look at the cemetery. Chasing shadows, he murmured to himself. That's what it had been from the start. He'd been chasing a phantom, a ghost of darkness, never realizing that the shadow had been at his side, cast by a man who walked in the light by day and killed in the dark of night. He didn't know if he would ever truly heal from this betrayal, but he knew one thing. He would never forget the lessons it taught him. Evil can wear the face of a friend. Trust can be shattered in an instant. Frank started the engine and pulled away, leaving the grave of Detective Alan Reynolds behind. The rain was light now, almost a drizzle, and as he drove off, a weak sunbeam broke through the clouds, shining on the wet pavement ahead. For the first time in weeks, Frank allowed himself a deep breath. The case was over. The shadows were dispersed by daylight. There would be other days, other cases. He would continue, somehow. As he left the cemetery gates, Frank Chapman knew the memory of these events would haunt him, but he also knew he had done his duty in the end. The city was safe from the killer's knife. The nightmare ended. Yet in the quiet corners of his soul, he would always wonder if he could have seen the truth sooner, saved more lives, even saved Alan from himself. Those were questions for another time. For now, he headed home alone, the steady hum of the engine his only company, and the fading echoes of a friendship turned tragedy riding with him like a shadow that would never quite let go.